You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's Friday, April 26th. I'm Sachi McClendon.
And I'm Stephanie Horton. Long-awaited repairs on the L train tunnel begin tonight, and that means longer waits for riders.
Look, this train needs bettering at the end of the day, and it has to be done sometime.
Social isolation has long been a problem of modern life, but some sufferers have anxiety so severe they can't even leave their room.
My mother will occasionally bring me food. I don't really have to interact with the world at all.
Furniture giant IKEA is known for more than just selling beds and couches.
I want to get the ice cream, I want to get the hot dog, I want to get the candy.
Now the retailer is changing its business strategy and opening smaller stores. And that means no more Swedish meatballs.
Yesterday, New Jersey's governor signed a bill to help low-income students make their loan payments. But will it help the students who need it most?
All that and more on Uptown Radio. But first, the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Janine Herbst. The president visited in Indianapolis today to speak to the NRA's annual meeting and announced before a cheering crowd his intention to withdraw from an international arms treaty. True to his reputation as a showman, the president signed the order on stage in front of thousands of NRA members and then threw his pen into the crowd. NPR's Tim Mack has more from the NRA convention.
The UN Arms Trade Treaty was initially signed by former President Obama. He sent it to the Senate for ratification during his second term, but it stalled there. Nearly 100 countries have now ratified the treaty. In a lengthy speech, Trump announced that he was rejecting the treaty, which attempts to regulate international arms trade in conventional weapons.
Under my administration, we will never surrender American sovereignty to anyone. We will never allow foreign bureaucrats to trample on your Second Amendment freedom.
The president urged NRA members to go out and vote for him in 2020, stressing that he would be a staunch defender of gun rights. Tim Mack, NPR News, Indianapolis.
The U.S. economy grew at a better-than-expected pace of 3.2% during the first quarter of the year. NPR's Scott Horsley reports that's a turnaround from the final months of 2018.
The Commerce Department says economic growth accelerated during the first quarter, topping 3%, just as the White House had predicted. Many outside forecasters are not so optimistic, though. Economist Ben Herzon of IHS Markit says first quarter growth was fueled in part by a buildup in business inventories, which is not likely to be sustained.
The pace at which they're building inventories can't last. So I think what's going to happen is after a first quarter burst in inventory building, that inventory building is going to slow down and contribute to a slowing in overall GDP growth.
Herzon predicts overall growth for the year in the neighborhood of 2%. The Commerce Department says business investment slowed in the first quarter, as did federal spending. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
Activists in Hungary say authorities are denying food to migrants stuck in transit zones on the country's borders. Joanna Kakissis has more.
The Hungarian Helsinki Committee documented 13 cases of deliberate starvation since last August. Hungarian authorities denied food to 21 migrants, including children. Activists call this a human rights violation, but the Hungarian government says it doesn't have to feed migrants whose asylum requests it has denied.
Joanna Kakissis reporting. The Supreme Court of Kansas ruled today that the state constitution protects abortion rights and blocked a 2015 law that banned a second trimester abortion procedure. The court said vague language protecting equal and inalienable rights in the first section of the Kansas Constitution's Bill of Rights grants a natural right of personal autonomy that includes the right to control one's own body. Wall Street higher just before the closing bell. This is NPR.
From Columbia Radio News in New York, this is Maddie Foley. This afternoon, the Archdiocese of New York released a list of 120 priests charged with sexual abuse or possession of pornography. The list spans nearly a century. Many of the priests were ordained in the 1950s. Cardinal Timothy Dolan tweeted that no one on the list was actively serving in ministry. Most, he said, have died. Officials in Rockland County have renewed a local state of emergency, which was set to expire early this morning. The number of measles cases continues to rise. 50 new cases over the last few weeks have made this the largest outbreak in the country since 2000. Effective today, the renewed state of emergency does not include the Measles Outbreak Emergency Directive that the previous declaration did. That directive prohibited non-vaccinated citizens from entering public spaces and was overturned by a judge after complaints from dozens of parents. Nearly 40 blocks of Manhattan will be clear of cars this Saturday as the annual Car-Free Earth Day takes effect. The pedestrian-friendly zones will run from 17th Street to 47th Street in Midtown and 181st to 190th Uptown. Officials are expected to announce on Sunday the reinstatement of two-way tolling on the Verrazano Bridge. The $19 toll to Staten Island will reportedly be split to $9.50 each way. Tonight marks the start of the L train slowdown. The long-term tunnel construction will cause trains to run every 20 minutes. The work is expected to last for at least 15 months. Also tonight, the Islanders are facing off against the Carolina Hurricanes in the second round of playoffs. The Islanders swept the Pittsburgh Penguins last week on their quest for the Stanley Cup. And the Bronx is getting its first bookstore in nearly 5 years. The Lit Bar is opening this weekend in Mott's Point. It's currently 55 degrees and stormy on the Upper West Side. Cloudy skies will continue through the weekend, potentially putting a damper on Brooklyn's annual Cherry Blossom Festival. We'll hear about the history of New York's cherry trees coming up this hour. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Maddie Foley.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Stephanie Horton.
And I'm Sachi McClendon.
The original plan for repairs to the L train called for shutting down the line completely for over a year. Instead, a revised plan takes effect tonight.
L trains will run every 20 minutes between Brooklyn and Manhattan during evenings, nights, and weekends.
It's a slowdown instead of a shutdown, but as Camille Peterson reports, the slowdown will still create issues for commuters.
The Broadway Junction L stop is in Brownsville, Brooklyn. It's near the end of the L line, and it's an above-ground stop with an outdoor platform that looks out onto a network of trains. It's 9 a.m. Trains into Manhattan are arriving every few minutes. Michael Beckton is standing on the platform. Every weekday he commutes to Manhattan on the L. He doesn't work nights or weekends, so he says he won't be affected by the slowdown.
But I'm concerned about my wife because she works at a retail establishment in Manhattan, and some days she works late at night. Now there'll be a 20-minute wait.
At Bedford Avenue, just one stop from Manhattan, the platform is dense with commuters waiting to get on packed trains. Marianne is one of them. She says the slowdown is inevitable.
Look, this train needs bettering at the end of the day, and it has to be done sometime. And if we suffer a little bit, I'm fine with that.
Jonathan Peters researches transportation policy at CUNY. He says an L train slowdown instead of a shutdown may actually increase commuters' suffering in the long run. That's because a slowdown is pretty inefficient.
Every day, suddenly you have to stop what you're doing, you have to get out of the way of the trains, and then you have to run and operate the system for 18 hours or 15 hours.
He says because of that inefficiency, it'll take longer to get the L running normally again. Plus, the slowdown could cost more money than a shutdown, which means the MTA won't have the funds for repairs and improvements on other lines.
We'll be talking about this in 5 years or 10 years because the project that could have gone forward might be deferred.
At the Bedford Avenue stop, Marianne says commuters are getting creative to deal with the slowdown. Ubers to other subway lines, buses, ferries.
It's not ideal, but again, if it means we get better service, I'm okay with that.
The slowdown starts tonight at 8 p.m. It's expected to last for 18 to 20 months. Camille Peterson, Columbia Radio News.
Sachi, what do you think of when you hear IKEA?
I don't really think of furniture. I did go to the cafeteria once for dinner, though.
Well, a new IKEA opened last week in Manhattan, but it's very different from the warehouse stores. It's smaller, just a showroom for online orders, and it doesn't sell meatballs. Reporter Bianca Giacobone went to the Upper East Side to check it out.
IKEA isn't just a furniture store, it's a cultural experience. The Swedish meatballs, dirt cheap ice cream cones, blue and yellow plastic bags, and entire days spent in a maze of affordable furniture. These are the things that make IKEA what it is. All around the world, the stores look the same and sell pretty much the same things.
I'm Alesia Preiter from Milan, Italy.
I remember going to IKEA when I was a child.
Preiter says the experience was special because she could try out all the beds.
And feel like a princess.
Hi, my name is Surabhi and I live in Delhi NCR. What I love about IKEA furniture is that they're super classic. They are very good looking pieces.
My name is Emanuele. I live in London. I love assembling the furniture at home.
He might be the only one who likes that, but there is consistency in IKEA's 400 stores around the world.
IKEA is IKEA everywhere.
That is Beck Coet, senior editor at Fortune magazine. She wrote an article called How IKEA Took Over the World.
So I think that the way the store is structured and sort of the experience of spending a day there is a real cultural phenomenon.
But the newly opened Manhattan store is different. For one thing, this store is right in the city center to cater to the increasing urban population. People with little time and no car. People like me. So, since I needed to do some furniture shopping, I went to check it out. I am going to buy a bedside table at IKEA. My bedside table has been a cardboard box for the past 10 months, and it's time for an upgrade. So here we are. This IKEA is the quietest IKEA I've ever visited, and it's small. If the average IKEA store is the size of 5 football fields, this is more like half of a football field. They don't sell food, and the only plastic blue bags are the ones handed out as souvenirs. Hi, can I ask you something? If I want to buy a bedside table, how does that work? For a $20 bedside table, I would have had to pay a $10 delivery fee. So I left the table there. You can't physically bring anything home from this IKEA. It works as a showroom, where IKEA's employees will help you plan your home. IKEA has already opened 2 similar stores in London and in Moscow. They are part of IKEA's effort to offer consumers a different options to the traditional big box stores. It's the first time IKEA has changed its business strategy since it opened more than 70 years ago. Leonard Sherman is a professor at Columbia Business School.
More and more companies are implementing what's called an omni-channel or multi-channel strategy, which is to say we want to give consumers a choice as to what is most convenient to them.
That means that if you're IKEA, you want to keep your big box store and your loyal customer that loves Swedish meatballs. And you want to give the people who hate going to IKEA the option of buying IKEA anyway, online or in a smaller, easier store. It's similar to what Amazon is doing. It sells online, but it's opened physical bookstores too. The store in Manhattan is among the first of 30 city center stores IKEA will open worldwide in the next 3 years. Fortune magazine editor Beth Coet is a little surprised they won't sell food in any of them.
That's one of my favorite parts of going to IKEA. I want to get the ice cream, I want to get the hot dog, I want to get the candy.
Coet says there just might be no room for both Billy bookcases and cinnamon buns.
In New York City, they're in really tight spaces because that's how we live.
As for the meatballs, you'll still have to go all the way to the big box IKEA store in Brooklyn to have some of those. Bianca Giacobone, Columbia Radio News.
Manhattan's waterfront used to be home to one of the world's busiest ports.
Freighters lined the docks, and the water around the island was severely polluted. Now with the ships mostly gone, the cleaned-up waterfront has become prime real estate for development, public parks, and other uses.
But this transition has led to a new problem. No one is exactly sure who is in charge. Moira Warburton explores a potential solution.
Gowanus Canal these days is lined with trees and benches. A newly paved path running beside it is filled with joggers, dog walkers. It's surrounded by a mix of new apartment complexes and old warehouses. It's beautiful, as long as you don't look too closely at the water.
Sort of a galaxy of pollution with the sun glinting off of all of it.
Brad Vogel is the captain of the Gowanus Dredgers Canoe Club. They lead tours around the famously polluted canal to let people get a close-up view of what was once an industrial waterway.
As we're standing here, you can sense the more complicated and the new waterfront that's emerging increasingly.
The new waterfront is happening on land that had been largely abandoned as Manhattan's port shrank. Combining that with the Clean Water Act coming into effect meant the shores weren't so gross anymore. Roland Lewis is the executive director of the Waterfront Alliance, a coalition of groups that have a stake along New York City's shores.
Then it became our back door. We basically shoved everything we didn't want out there on the
available land because it was polluted, and it's become the front door again.
A lot of people wanted in. Land developers, residents, ferry services, all of these groups and more have competing needs. The problem, Lewis says, is that governing these groups is incredibly complicated. It feels like there are as many city agencies in charge along the waterfront as there are stakeholders.
There are, I believe, 14 different city agencies that have jurisdiction in one way or other over the waterfront. You name it, everyone's got a piece of the pie.
Then you've got state-level departments, the Coast Guard, the Army Corps of Engineers. Basically, says Vogel from the Gowanus Dredgers, anytime you have an issue, you don't really know where to go.
You feel like you're talking to completely disconnected limbs on a body that really should be connected as a whole.
Carlina Salguero is the executive director of Portside, a maritime education center in Red Hook. As the manager of a historic ship, every day she navigates the patchwork of rules and regulators just to operate her ship.
The underlying way of thinking about and planning and building the managing of the waterfront is what really needs to change. To use kind of mariners' slang, landlubbers have been designing and running the show.
Both Salguero and Vogel think the solution might be at hand, a new city office of the waterfront.
It would be nice to have one central point of contact for waterfront issues, especially someone who would see all the different components and variables in play.
Basically, the office would be in charge of creating policy and solving problems to do with New York City's waterfront. It's not just about coordination. Salguero and Vogel both feel the city government has lacked a voice for smaller groups like theirs along the waterfront.
We need some bigger player to be able to come in to help advocate for the waterfront because many of the city agencies are not listening to us.
Marshall Foster is the executive director of the Office of the Waterfront in Seattle, the only other city in the U.S. with this kind of agency. He says this kind of office can work, but its mandate needs to be explicit.
You have to be careful to decide what exactly are you asking that new office to do, and are you actually giving them authority to cut through bureaucracy to make it happen?
For Salguero at Portside Marine Center, it's less important what powers the new office has. What matters is whether they listen to their constituents, especially people like historic ship owners who feel they've been ignored over the years. Because she says ultimately, the city is losing out.
We're losing all sorts of opportunities of moving freight by water, moving a people by water. We've evolved just a wee bit from what was the 1980s point of view in New York City, where water was just something to look at.
The proposal is currently being discussed in committee and will be voted on in the coming weeks. Moira Warburton, Columbia Radio News.
Elizabeth Warren made headlines this week by proposing a plan to cancel federal student loan debt. New Jersey is already tackling the problem. 2 bills signed yesterday in the Garden State adjust loan payments depending on income. Payments on defaulted loans will also be allowed. I sat down with Professor Kevin Doherty at Columbia University's Teachers College to talk about what this means for former students struggling with their payments. All right, Professor Kevin Doherty, thank you so much for speaking to me today.
I'm very happy to talk to you as well.
So I wanted to speak to you today about student loans.
Mm-hmm.
So should the students of New Jersey feel relieved that, this kind of legislation could be or is going to be passed?
Relieved? I think happy. Is there more work to be done? I think there is. But, as a resident of New Jersey, I'm really happy the state did this.
Is there any way that you see this sort of like becoming a trend for other states in the future?
I think there's a lot of interest in this across the country. Is New Jersey going to have that much of an influence? I don't know, but there are probably a lot of other states that are thinking about it, and that's good. So these New Jersey reforms are good, but there's still a lot to be done.
What do you think legislation introduced in New Jersey would mean for students who maybe couldn't afford to go to college otherwise?
I looked at the legislation, and I think the governor just signed it. There are 2 things that I think very interesting. One is shifting the state's student loan program to income-based repayment. So the amount of money that students have to pay year by year would be key to their income. So if you're not making that much money, your loan payments wouldn't have to be super high. And the other thing for students who have defaulted, and loan default is a huge problem for students if it happens, giving them a way to be able to repay the loan and get out from under the default.
But what happens if someone does default on their loans? Like, what are the consequences?
It affects your credit rating. It has huge consequences for what's going to happen to you afterwards. So people are very afraid of it, and we're getting major problems of people defaulting on their loans, largely because they're ending up in jobs that don't pay that well. A good number of them may have gone to a proprietary school.
And what is a proprietary school?
A for-profit school. And, they're good ones and they're bad ones. But the problems of people defaulting on their debts is much higher for people who've gone to proprietary schools, particularly if they left without getting a degree. Under, I think it was the Clinton administration, a law was passed making student loan debt non-dischargeable, meaning you can't declare bankruptcy and get out from under that debt. It's always going to be there.
All right, thank you so much for speaking to me.
You're welcome. Thank you for calling.
Japan has long struggled with a problem, hikikomori. It's the term for people suffering from social isolation. They stop going to work, to school, or even leaving home. The problem has become so widespread that the Japanese government has stepped in to help.
Hikikomori are also in the U.S., but Sachi, you found that they don't have the same support here as in Japan.
A decade ago, Daniel Griffiths cut himself off from the world. He was 40 years old, working in IT, and completely burnt out. Since then, he says he has barely left his apartment in Houston.
Was it Plato or Socrates said a man who can live by himself is either an animal or a god? I don't know which one I am.
If you're wondering why he sounds jolly, it's because he says he's come to terms with his isolation. And while Griffiths isn't sure whether he's an animal or a god, he does know he's hikikomori. That's the name of a group of modern-day hermits who cut almost all social ties and rarely leave their homes. The condition is most well known in Japan, but it's spreading to many Western countries, to people like Griffiths, who have no Japanese roots. We spoke via Skype.
My mother will occasionally bring me food, so I can literally stay in my dwelling, and because of the internet and so forth, I don't really have to interact with the world at all.
But hikikomori struggle with the condition, and on the other side of the door are concerned family and friends, like Valley Harrison in Kentucky. Her son Zach is 30.
I will have to tell you, I haven't seen my son for a year. He lives in my house. I take him food in the evenings. I put it on a little cart so he hears me rolling it. I knock on the door and I say, "Here's your food, sweetie."
Harrison says her son has been shut in his bedroom for over 5 years. She said she's tried everything to help him out and feels like she has nowhere to turn. But if Harrison were in Japan, she'd have a number of options. Dr. Xander Krieg is a psychologist in the Japanese city of Kobe. He says Japan's government funds clinics to help hikikomori.
Places where people can just kind of go. And there's normally some sort of therapist or school counselor or sometimes a clinical psychologist or a volunteer that'll be there to kind of monitor people, but it's giving people without a place to go a place to go.
There are also job programs and a magazine run by former and current hikikomori to spread awareness. There's even a new Rent-a-Sister program that tries to rehabilitate them back into society. And for more severe cases, schools will send counselors to speak to hikikomoris through their doors. In Japan, it's estimated 300,000 are struggling with hikikomori. But in America, we don't know.
In medicine, we haven't felt like social isolation is a health issue.
That's Dr. Alan Teo. He's a psychiatrist in Oregon. He's one of the few researchers looking into American hikikomori. He's been pushing for the condition to be taken more seriously in the States. He wrote a paper proposing the American Psychiatric Association formally recognize hikikomori as a mental disorder. Official recognition often helps to improve diagnosis and research, but he hasn't had any success there. Dr. Teo says the reality is that hikikomori is complicated.
In one way, hikikomori is similar to all types of medical conditions in that there are biological factors, there are psychological factors, and then there are also cultural and social factors.
In Japan, popular research links hikikomori to the country's culture. Japan is known for its strict adherence to social norms, like not leaving work until your boss leaves first. Dr. Teo says another key problem is ame, an overly doting mother-child relationship. All of these things hikikomori can find overwhelming. But America has a completely distinct culture, so why is the condition showing up here? Dr. Teo has a hypothesis. It's something found in many modern cultures: loneliness. But none of this helps Valley Harrison, the American mom. She doesn't know where to go next with her son. Her last-ditch effort has been to reach out to online hikikomori message boards.
I keep asking these people, what can I do? What can I do? And they say, just keep telling him you're there, telling him you love him, and tell him, and maybe someday he'll decide to come out.
So for now, Harrison waits. Sachi McClendon, Columbia Radio News.
From our commentary series, reporter Lauren Lantry recalls how her family taught her what it means to be there for each other.
While I was growing up, my parents lived apart from each other, but they weren't separated or divorced. My dad's a lawyer, and he had a case that lasted 10 years. It was based out of Chicago, so my mom raised my two brothers and me in Los Angeles, pretty much as a single parent. I call my dad by his first name, Kevin. I don't exactly remember when I started doing that. I just remember how excited I was when I got to see him. From my room, I could hear his car pull into the driveway on the weekends, and he'd start whistling as he approached the house. And as soon as the door would open, he would yell, "Robbie, Lord, Orsina, Stewie!" And we'd drop everything and run to him. When my mom came home, it was, "School's fine. Mom, I can't talk. I have homework." My mom's a total badass. She moved out of her house when she was 13 and put herself through medical school. And now, she delivers hundreds of babies every year. But back then, she was the mom whose beeper went off during a piano recital. When I was growing up, I only had eyes for Kevin. I have this photo of us from my childhood. It's still taped to my bedroom wall back home. In it, I'm in the driver's seat of one of those little tyke plastic cars. Its roof is bright yellow, and the body of the car bright red. My brother's laying on top of it, holding on for dear life, and Kevin's pushing us. He's wearing green pants that are too big for him, and a similarly colored shirt tucked in. His hair is parted perfectly down the middle, and his round frame glasses sit squarely on his nose. This is my proof that Kevin was really there. When I was in elementary school, I considered my birthday to be a national holiday. I still kind of do, to be honest. But Kevin missed most of them. One year, he came home from a business trip in New York, and he said he had a birthday gift for me. I was so excited. Had he brought home a piece of the Statue of Liberty or an artifact from the 9/11 museum? But when I opened the box, it was a bright pink sweatshirt with neon splatter paint across the front and big black block letters that said, "I Heart New York." I tried to act happy, but I went to my room and I cried. I was a tomboy, and I hated pink. How did Kevin not know that? Then, in 7th grade, Kevin and I were in a McDonald's. As I got an M&M McFlurry, he stepped outside for a call. He walked back in about 10 minutes later, and he had this look on his face, a huge smile, and the wrinkles around his eyes were lit up with joy. He ordered a second M&M McFlurry, and he handed it to me. I was shocked. That was the day Kevin closed his 10-year asbestos case. He moved home. I thought life was going to change. We'd start vacationing more, or he would drive me to my volleyball tournaments. But none of that happened. He kept missing games and cut vacation short to go back to work. Looking back, I wouldn't change anything about my relationship with Kevin. It remains pretty perfect in my memories. But I wish I had spent more time with my mom, rather than slamming my bedroom door and messaging my friends on AIM. I wish I would have snuggled with her on the couch as she read. I wish I would have answered her all those times she asked me how my day was. Now that I'm the one living thousands of miles away and working 7 days a week, it's my mom I call when I'm walking home.
Lauren Lantry also wants to remind listeners, call your mother. You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Stephanie Horton.
And I'm Sachi McClendon.
Today's the last day of Earth Week. Coming up, we have stories about animals. A new law would ban the sale of certain critters in New York City pet stores.
And urban bird enthusiasts are using cell phone apps to help protect our feathered friends.
These stories and more coming up. But first, these headlines.
From Columbia Radio News, I am Bianca Giacobone. President Donald Trump has said the United States will withdraw from the International Arms Trade Treaty during its annual remarks to the NRA. The treaty attempts to keep weapons out of the hands of human rights abusers, but the NRA argues it would undermine domestic gun rights. Just one day after entering the Democratic race, Joe Biden has raised more than $6 million in donations, as confirmed by his campaign spokesman. On the talk show The View earlier today, Biden defended the way he treated Anita Hill during the Clarence Thomas nomination hearings for the Supreme Court back in '91.
I think what she wants you to say is, I'm sorry for the way I treated you, not for the way you were treated.
If you go back and look what I said and didn't say, I don't think I treated her badly.
The controversy around the hearings has been renewed since Hill said she was dissatisfied with Biden's previous apology. The Pentagon is set to send 300 more troops to the Mexico-U.S. border. The new troops will be driver, lawyers, and cooks. The cooks will hand out meals, breaking with past policies to avoid contacts with migrants. There are currently around 5,000 troops at the border. Sri Lanka police continues to look for 140 suspects after the Easter Sunday bombings. The attacks have killed more than 250 people, and the Prime Minister has warned the danger is not over. Sri Lanka Archbishop has advised people to stay inside.
This particular group that calls itself ISIS connected, they have threatened to continue with these attacks indefinitely.
The attacks are weakening Sri Lanka's economy, which was already amongst the worst in Asia. Stocks hit a 6-year low earlier this week. Our economy, on the other hand, is doing better than expected. The GDP grew at 3.2% annual rate since January. It's another indication the U.S. is continuing its 10 years recovery. For Columbia Radio News, I am Bianca Giacobone.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Stephanie Horton.
And I'm Sachi McClendon.
For the first time, artwork by former President of South Africa Nelson Mandela has come to the United States. On May 2nd, Mandela's pastel drawing goes up for bids at Bonham's Auction House. This work is expected to sell for upwards of $60,000. But its beginnings were much more humble. Hannah Critchfield reports.
Rows of colorful, elaborate paintings and sculptures line the modern and contemporary African art gallery at Bonham's. At the center of the exhibit is a small crayon sketch of a purple prison cell. Nelson Mandela, an anti-apartheid activist, spent 27 years in a cell like this. A few years after his release, he became president of the country. When he retired, he began drawing as a therapeutic activity. His sketches all feature his time in prison, but this one is of cell number 5, his cell at Robben Island.
You know, I went in with him to his prison cell, and it was so tiny.
That's Sam Venter. She's a researcher at the Mandela Foundation and a longtime reporter who covered Mandela throughout his lifetime. She was with him the first time he went back to visit after his release.
When he lay down, his head could touch one side of the cell and his feet the other. And I was just struck by the size of it and the fact that he had to spend from the late afternoon to the early morning every weekday locked up in that room.
Venter says conditions inside the prison mirrored the segregated conditions outside. Black prisoners were not given pajamas, regardless of how cold it was. Visitors were allowed just once a month for 30 minutes at a time.
You know, when he was in prison, his mother died, and he was not allowed to attend her funeral, and his son was killed in a car accident the next year, and he was also not allowed to attend the funeral. When we were on Robben Island with him, the only time he became a little bit emotional was when he said, "I remember the last time I saw my mother. I watched her as she turned and walked away from the visitors' room back to the harbour to get the boat back to Cape Town, and I knew that was the last time I was going to see her."
Mandela's drawing is a close-up of the iron bars in his cell door. It's drawn from the perspective of someone outside looking in. There's a key turned slightly in the lock. The door is about to be opened. Giles Pepiat is the director of modern and contemporary African art at Bonhams. He says the piece is hopeful.
And I think the story of Nelson Mandela has to be one of great optimism.
Apartheid ended in 1994 when democratic, multiracial elections took place in the country. As he was creating the sketches, Mandela wrote,
"Today when I look at Robben Island, I see it as a celebration of the struggle and a symbol of the finest qualities of the human spirit, rather than as a monument to the brutal tyranny and oppression of apartheid."
The sketch on display is the only piece Mandela made that he kept throughout his life, and that's why Pepiat says it's so important.
I mean, the word iconic is used so much now, it's almost lost any value or meaning, but this is an iconic piece, and I think in future it will become a totem, an icon to Mandela.
The Mandela Foundation says the proceeds from the sale will be used for education in South Africa and racial reconciliation projects in the United States. The sketch goes on auction May 2nd. Hannah Critchfield, Columbia Radio News.
If you came across a gaggle of children exploring a city park this week, you can thank New York's Urban Park Rangers. Kids Week is a free program coinciding with spring break. And as Rebecca Ward reports, the week is about more than just fun and games.
James Cregan is one of the youngsters waiting for the Rangers on a sunny day in Central Park North. Shaggy-haired James came prepared for a nature hike with bright yellow binoculars.
There are two big circles in the front, and the smaller circles are for your eyes. You use them for looking at things closer.
His mom, Elizabeth Jimenez Cregan, who came along for the hike, says she hunts online for chances for James to get outdoors.
We try to check in the website for the New York City parks, and anything that we see that he might like, we do it. Like one time we did camping in the park overnight, and sometimes we go outside the city.
Sophia Min is also waiting for the hike to start. The second grader says she can't wait to visit Central Park's wildlife.
We're gonna hike right here and see like a fish and turtles in the river.
All right, so if everybody could come.
The Rangers showed up, and both kids went running to the park bench where two Rangers stood for a bird's eye view of their small hiking crew.
All right, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Ranger Yvonne. This is
Ranger Dan.
The Rangers hand out bright markers and forms with photos of the park's wildlife and start to walk, with dozens of little footsteps in tow. Ranger Dan stops under a weeping willow.
This is what we call our natural classroom.
And tells everyone to be quiet and listen.
That was the noise that we heard that sounded kind of like a trill, like that was the red-winged blackbird.
I heard that 3 times.
Really?
Uh-huh.
These moments do more than keep kids like James and Sophia busy. Bonnie McGuire is the director of the Urban Park Rangers.
I think it's important for kids to know how much the environment influences their lives in general, where air comes from and oxygen comes from that they need to breathe. Like, it's the connection to the natural world that hopefully spawns more stewardship for the parks, but also for the world as a whole.
Richard Louv writes and researches kids' connections to the natural world. He says there's a generational disconnect between humans and nature.
Increasingly, life is a virtual life in terms of primary experience with plants and animals and the life around us. And that has enormous implications for psychological health, physical health, but also with the future of the planet itself. People seldom take care of anything that they don't know personally, or especially if that they love.
But accessing nature in the city, even parkland, isn't always easy. Lorian Nesbitt researches access to nature in 10 American cities, including New York.
She found that
those people with higher levels of education and more income have better access to both mixed vegetation and woody vegetation, and to some degree that is also true for parks.
Which could limit those families' access to programs like this, depending on where they live. The city says about 1,000 kids in the 5 boroughs will have joined the Rangers this week, but they don't track how far they have to travel. Both Sophia and James live pretty close to the Harlem Mere, the lake they're hiking around. After rounding the lake, the kids are back at their starting point. Along the hike, they marked off the species they saw. Each had their own cross-out style. Some are big scribbles, some delicate lines. By the time Sophia got to the end, she had a sheet full of deliberate red X's.
It was good. I'll tell one of my friends that I just found like squirrels, a wet red with a black bird.
But at the end of the hike, there is no counting of X's. Ranger Dan says that's not the point.
My hope is just that they know that there's nature that they can come and explore as well as recreate in. There's other life in the city other than humans, that if we're super loud and on our phones or whatever, that you're not going to see anything, but if you are quiet and are looking for things, that you can find them.
Kids Week runs every DOE school break. The next will be in December. Rebecca Ward, Columbia Radio News. This week marks the height of the spring migratory bird season, when millions of birds fly through the 5 boroughs on their way north. The city can be a dangerous place for our feathered friends, but new birdwatching apps are raising awareness and changing laws. Maddie Foley has more.
Well, that's a northern cardinal singing again. Weep, 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 weep.
When David Barrett goes out for a day of birdwatching in Central Park, he packs light. Binoculars? Check. Comfortable walking shoes? Check.
And, well, of course, my mobile.
Yeah. Fully charged?
Fully charged, yes.
Double check. Barrett runs Manhattan Bird Alert, a Twitter account that provides a constant stream of bird sightings to nearly 19,000 followers. Barrett has been competitively birding, yes, that's a thing, for nearly a decade. But over the last few years, his smartphone has become a necessary field tool. There's Merlin, an app filled with pictures of birds and recordings of their calls.
So we can pick one up like the blue-winged teal.
There's an app for listing all the birds you've seen, called eBird.
eBird is your scoreboard.
And now there's even an app for counting dead birds. Thousands of them dot the city's streets every spring. Because while New York is at the heart of the East Coast migratory path, its tall buildings and bright lights are dangerously confusing from the sky.
We estimate between 90,000 and 230,000 birds die each year in New York City alone.
That's Andrew Moss, who works for dBird. D is short for dead. dBird is a crowdsourced, mobile-friendly data collection site run by the New York City Audubon Society. Birds, tired from their grueling flights, head straight for New York's lush parks. But skyscrapers often loom nearby, creating an optical illusion for the weary travelers.
Birds will see the glass, they'll reflect some greenery, whether it's a park or some trees nearby, and birds will think it's like a safe place for them to rest.
Moss says dBird was born out of necessity. A few years ago, birdwatching apps first began appearing on phones. People started calling the Audubon Society in record numbers to report the dead birds they saw on their walks. And the Audubon Society realized they could mobilize, literally, this growing group of concerned citizens. Paul Sweet is an ornithologist at the American Museum of Natural History.
Back before the internet and smartphones, you would basically only meet other birders when you were out birding.
But services like dBird and eBird and Merlin have served as connective tissue.
And it's nice to see so many young people getting involved in birding. Definitely a more diverse group of birders than perhaps would have been out there, 25 years ago.
Today, the dBird database has logged over 7,000 dead and injured birds. These numbers have served as the backbone to several recent pieces of bird protection legislation. In January, the bipartisan Bird Safe Buildings Act was introduced to Congress. Last month, a similar bill was proposed in the New York City Council. Both pieces of legislation would require the majority of new bills to use glazed bird-friendly glass, and both have benefited from dBird's crowdsourced data. Some critics have said the bills go too far. Bird-safe glass costs around 5% more than its standard cousin. So what if some birds die?
Does a blackpoll warbler really help humankind in any way at all? Maybe not.
Paul Sweet again.
Maybe it's just great that we have them, that they're a species that's evolved over millennia to exist and to live their life, and we should just appreciate them for what they are.
And that's what's at the heart of birdwatching apps. Appreciation. Something David Barrett is an expert in.
It's a cute little sparrow. It has a delightful song too, which I'll play for you. All right.
That's how it works.
That's how it works.
Maddie Foley, Uptown Radio.
You might have noticed the cherry blossoms blooming throughout the city. There's even a festival to celebrate the occasion at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden this weekend. It's called Sakura Matsuri. I spoke with Anne McClellan, who has written extensively about the symbolism behind Japan's famous flower. Anne McClellan, hi. I appreciate you joining us this morning.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. So let's jump in. For the poor soul who's never laid eyes on the flower, can you describe for us what the sakura cherry blossom looks like?
That's a great question. There are hundreds of different varieties, literally, and there are two main sorts. One are the kinds that create the cloud-like effect. Those are the ones where the blossoms bloom on bare branches so there are no leaves interspersed. The colors can range from white to pink to almost a deep red, practically. The other type is intended to be seen close up, and they tend to have plumper blossoms with more, can be as many as 30 or more petals per bloom.
So what has the cherry blossom represented historically?
It's hard to overestimate how important the cherry blossom is as a symbol for the Japanese people. There's a poem from a Japanese poet named Motori, and he says, "If one should ask you concerning the spirit of a true Japanese, point to the wild cherry blossom glowing in the sun." And why is that? I think it's partly because for this one glorious moment, every spring they shine forth and bring beauty to all of us and inspire us to keep going. So that also leads to its connection with the samurai, which the whole idea of the samurai is you spend your life training, both your body, your mind, your spirit for that moment where you're going to shine in glory and vanquish your enemy. And then your ideal would be to die at that moment in the fullness of your strength. And what the cherry blossoms do is that for each variety, the petals fall at the same time and they fall full. They don't shrivel up. They're falling full of vigor. And that's the samurai ideal. That's one of the things that inspired the kamikaze pilots.
So the kamikaze were inspired by the short life of the cherry blossom?
Right, the short life of the cherry blossom, yes. And in fact, I just recently saw photographs of kamikaze planes, and they have cherry blossom symbols on them. So this was a conscious thing by the Japanese government to convince these really young boys to give up their lives, really, for the country.
And so why are we now celebrating Sakura Matsuri here in the U.S. today?
Well, the overriding element of the cherry blossoms is that they bring the promise of renewal, the promise of new life, the promise of a fresh start. And another famous poem by Tetsujo goes, "When the cherry blossoms bloomed, they brought beauty to my heart." And we all need that. Any person, any age, any nationality, who doesn't need that?
Anne McClellan, author of the Cherry Blossom Festival Sakura Celebration. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Brooklyn Botanic Garden Sakura Matsuri Cherry Blossom Festival starts tomorrow at 10 a.m.
A group of New York lawmakers and animal activists are working to build support for a new law that would ban the sale of certain animals from pet stores. Reporter Cynthia Betubiza has more.
Rain and wind couldn't keep kids away from the window display at American Kennels. Their faces were stuck to the glass. Inside, rows of puppies are for sale. Some fluffy, the odd pit bull. Some so tiny you could fit them into the palm of your two hands. Don Jones manages the store on the Upper East Side. He says people come as far away as Saudi Arabia to buy his puppies.
They love our animals because we are the A-rated store in the city of New York.
A new law may soon stop Jones from selling dogs. Last month, members of the New York Senate introduced a bill that would ban the sale of dogs, cats, and rabbits from pet stores. The bill ultimately seeks to stop puppy mills and negligent animal breeders. The bill now is in committee, and lawmakers want to build support for it so that it passes through the Senate. At a press conference this morning, animal rights activists and lawmakers came out swinging. They slammed puppy mills for what they call horrific conditions. John Goodwin is with the Humane Society.
They can keep these dogs in cages only 6 inches longer than their body. They can stand on wire their entire lives with their paws never touching a blade of grass, bred every heat cycle till their bodies wear out, and then they can be killed when they're no longer producing a large number of puppies.
Assemblywoman Linda Rosenthal says people who buy cute puppies in the window often don't know where they come from.
If there were not a demand for those kinds of animals to unaware people, then we would not have as many of them bred.
Back at American Kennels, Jones says it's unfair for legislation to target all pet stores in the state. He's been getting his dogs from the same breeder for decades. He says the puppies that are in the store are well cared for.
On a weekly basis, our vet comes to our institution here and he examines our animals. We have a vet tech that's on premises.
For some people, it's as much of an emotional issue as it is a legal one. Jacqueline Castanera owns a 24-hour doggy daycare on the Upper East Side.
They're so amazing, loving dogs out there, and I almost want to cry talking about it.
Castanera says she urges her clients to adopt a dog rather than buy one. According to the ASPCA, around 670,000 dogs are euthanized each year because of overcrowded shelters. For Columbia Radio News, Cynthia Betubiza.
In this piece from our commentary series, Camille Peterson reflects on the changing nature of grief.
About a year ago, my grandma died. There are two things I remember most about the final week of her life. First, the last smile she gave me. She was in a shared hospital room. A flat-screen TV mounted on a beige wall showed images of calm, pristine rivers and played the kind of piano music that has no beginning, middle, or end. Her eyes were shut, but when I held her hand, she opened them and smiled so big her eyes became tiny. She kept smiling but clenched her eyes shut. I recognized this smile. She had given it to me my entire life, across kitchen tables and during long car rides. When she smiled at me in the hospital, she didn't remember my name or who I was, but the smile was the same. After a few days in the hospital, she came back to my grandpa's house. My grandpa set up a makeshift hospital bed for her in the living room. She was alive but unconscious. The second thing I remember about that time is the sound of her breath while she was home. For days, she was gasping for air. The sound haunted me. I heard it once in the ventilation of a hotel room. I thought about switching rooms but figured I'd hear the sound in every one. My grandma died a few days after coming home. There was a lot to do for the funeral. My mom and I tried to handle everything. We picked flowers, an urn, a casket. We went through my grandma's closet to pick out the clothes and jewelry she could be dressed in for the wake. I was in charge of the funeral playlist. I vaguely remembered the opera songs my grandma used to play for us, but not completely. I Googled lyrics and searched popular opera songs. I tried to name her favorite singers, Luciano Pavarotti, Andre Bocelli. I remembered how my grandma used to beg me to sit on the couch with her and watch recordings of Met Opera performances. This wasn't the first time someone in my family died. When I was 2, my father was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. When I was 8, he died from it, suddenly, in his sleep. After he died, I didn't know how to comfort my mom. I couldn't contribute anything to funeral arrangements like my older siblings could. I was too young to help. And that made me feel like I wasn't loving my father enough, like I failed him. I've never lost that feeling. So when my grandma died, I felt like I was getting a second chance at grief, a chance to prove I knew how to honor someone I loved and to care for my family members as they grieved. There was a mass after my grandma's wake. After mass, her casket was wheeled out to the front of the church. It was sunny. Chirping birds were in a kind of surround sound circle above the church. I was standing between my grandpa and Mom, and as my grandma's casket was loaded into the back of a hearse, I put one arm around each of them. It smelled like April, grass and dirt. Every spring, my grandma would take me into her backyard garden and teach me to plant scallions. She gave me a small shovel and a teal foam pad to kneel on, and when I did something wrong, she gave me that familiar smile. She didn't correct me. She just let me figure it out on my own.
For a photo of Camille and her grandma, check out uptownradio.org.
And that is it for this edition of Uptown Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show.
Our executive producer today was Alex Coletta. Leading our staff of reporters was senior producer Sophia Amati and general producer Allie Swinson.
Director Lauren Lantry coordinated our studio production with Maggie Green and Rebecca Ward.
Our web team, Andrea Salcedo, got this stream live to the web. Bianca Giarcabone and Maddie Foley produced the news. Senior editor Shannon Lynn and assistant editor Moira Warburton led our copy team.
Our instructors Joanne Farian, Sally Herships, and Ben Shapiro advised our staff along with Acacia O'Connor. I'm Stephanie Horton.
And I'm Sachi McClendon. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4. Until next time, you can always find us on uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Uptown Radio, thanks for listening.